Welcome once again. I'm Ashley Finley. I'm the Vice President for Research and Senior Advisor to the President at AAC&U. Delighted that you could join us for this session to talk a little bit more about recent report that AAC&U put out around the effects of community-based and civic learning in higher education. I'm joined for this session by my esteemed, not steamy, but esteemed, wonderful colleagues, Kathryn Enke and Jessica Chittum. Kathryn, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Kathryn Enke. Thank you for letting me be with you today. I'm Secretary to the Board and Strategist for Presidential Initiatives at AAC&U. That's a really long title, and it really just means that I do whatever is of highest priority to the association and to the president at that time. And so the fact that I'm working on this project, I think, really shows the importance of this project to AAC&U's work and to our ongoing mission. Go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Chittum. I'm the Director of Assessment and Pedagogical Innovation at AAC&U as well. That's in the Office of Curricular and Pedagogical Innovation. And we were collaborating across offices on this research. So it's been fun.
Exactly. This absolutely just wouldn't have happened without Kathryn and Jess and pulling a team together to do this. I think what we're about to describe is a bit of an undertaking. Any kind of literature review / research synthesis would be. So grateful for the contributions and collaborations across AAC&U to get this done. I'm just curious, in the chat, would you just indicate yes or no if you actually heard the first part of this when the session with Linda Garcia? I'm curious how many of you have a little bit of the background, which would help for this next bit. Yeah. Seems like most of you did, but no quizzes, Jean, I promise. Good to see you though. Okay, let me go ahead and share screen. And what I'd like to do at the beginning is do a little bit of a recap, slightly different slides, but a little bit of a recap of sort of the origin of why we undertook this research synthesis, why, and a very specific reason to provide some context for why we shaped it the way that we did. It really, that particular bit of the origin is really important. And then I'll turn it over to Kathryn and Jess to walk you through a little bit more of the specifics about what we found, what we didn't, the questions that remain, and we'll have some opportunity to talk a little bit about our own take on recommendations, but we certainly want to provide some opportunity to talk together about where you all think the research is, and most certainly what we have missed, right? That is what I have absolutely decided how great research does, is really ask questions about where we can go next, how we can do that together. We'll just make a quick, just scanning around. If you haven't muted yourself, maybe go ahead and do that. Doesn't automatically happen in Zoom. And I believe our wonderful tech producer, Lindsay at Campus Compact, has dropped in the Campus Compact Code of Conduct. Thank you, Lindsay. Right on cue. And so with that, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can walk you through some slides. I would be remiss not to mention our friends at Lumina Foundation for generously supporting this research and also supporting the fact that we can absolutely distribute this for free. It is downloadable for free on our website. I hope you have an opportunity to check it out. So the background for, and I should also mention, feel free to pop in questions as we go along. If we're able to answer those in real time, we will absolutely try to do that, but at least it'll give us a whole group of things to come back to at the end. But please feel free to drop questions in. We have an hour, which feels luxurious compared to my 25-minute session earlier today. So we're excited that we have actually an opportunity to dialogue about this. I will tell you all in full transparency, it's the first time we've been able to present on this. So we're really excited to get your feedback to see what you're hearing and understanding for this, and certainly to understand where we can keep going. So the background for this research and the objectives that we were trying to do here were to synthesize findings, as you can read here, from the existing research on the efficacy of community-based engagement in higher education. That is a deceptively simple statement. Given the complexity of language around what qualifies and what's thought of as community engaged work and civic work. So you can tell from the title of the report itself that we bridge those by calling it community-based and civic engagement. We really took on the idea that those words tend to mean different things on campuses, and we did not want to presume going into this research synthesis that they would mean one thing singularly. So to narrow our scope to only those that mention civic, for example, or only those that mention community-based, we thought would be a fallacy and not as inclusive as we wanted to be. And you'll see that there's an interesting dichotomy with how we undertook this research synthesis, which was to both create a very narrow set of parameters around how we identified the research, but with certain conditions that would make it the most inclusive as possible. So we were trying to ride both of those lines. And we wanted to highlight the common themes across empirical studies that reach a particular evidence standard, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, around generalizability of findings. What we understood from the 2011, came out about 2011 as a companion piece to the Crucible Moment, I undertook a research review that basically produced quite a lot of evidence around what we know from service learning. So it was mostly focused around a single study, or sorry, a single practice. But it's one of those things where you go, I actually went back and read that in preparation, both for doing this research synthesis, but then also in doing the presentations. And one, I hate reading my writing, but two, I realized right away at the very front end of that literature review, I made very clear acknowledgement of I'm mostly seeing service learning studies, and they're mostly small scale in the sense that they are confined to a single campus, a single program, maybe a single year, a single cohort, relatively small sample sizes, which of course is terrific. And we understand quite a lot and can glean quite considerable amounts of meaning from those studies. They just are limited in their ability to expand beyond the confines of those particular studies. They're less able to be generalized to broader populations of students. And the emphasis of what we wanted to place on this research is the opportunity that Lumina gave us was to in fact say, well, what if, as I noted earlier today, what if we only focused, like what could we really say about the efficacy of this work if we really focused on those studies with the greatest amount of, as you would see here, the technical statistical term would be external validity, but that best ability to generalize to broader populations of students, the swayers out there, if you will, the ones that should be the most compelling to say, no, we know this works. This is statistically sound to be able to say, we know we can expand this. And then certainly, as you would with any kind of research, is absolutely to begin to use our set of research from this research synthesis to simply say, okay, what are the new gaps? Now it's 10 years later from when the Crucible Moment came out, and we learned so much from that report and the literature review that accompanied it. Now it's a decade later. What do we know? But then what could we know more? So we wanted to make sure we provide that opportunity for recommendations. I've mentioned just a little of this, but that I would just to highlight again that our approach to being more inclusive with the research synthesis while creating some narrow parameters to focus on generalizability, we also wanted to expand how we thought about what community practices looked like, right? So yes, we knew we would primarily encounter service learning. So we intentionally, and this is what Jess and Kathryn and I talked quite a lot about, we intentionally wanted to look for those studies that did look at global learning, that did look at internships, community-based research, field work, all with tremendous potential to have with community-based and civic elements to them. The other thing that we noted from previous work was there's a relatively narrow range of outcomes, as would be encountered by any single researcher pursuing some objective. so we wanted to take our opportunity in the research synthesis to expand the range of outcomes we were looking at the same time. And as I mentioned in the earlier session, we had 6 categories of outcomes that we looked at, which is, again, just a sort of expansive look at just how robust these practices are. Yes, in building personal and social responsibility, civic skills, if you will, but in so many other ways as well. This last one, I'll turn it over to Kathryn. We actually borrowed, this typology is actually borrowed from Valentine et al., a work that came out actually under Illumina's advisement as well, 3 years ago, maybe just a few years ago. And this is a very clever typology for looking at high impact practices. It's actually a terrific study. It's in our annotated bibliography. That's a companion of the research synthesis. So it's my first plug for that. We can come back to that. It is the living document that accompanies this work. So you can find this research piece in that. But what Valentine et al. Had done was actually taken the full list of 11 high impact practices and separated the ones that primarily happen on campus and the ones that primarily happen out in communities, which I don't think we'd really quibble with. For example, I would just insert that as we think about the efficacy of community-based civic practices, all high impact practices could be infused with that element. There's no question. Whether it's a learning community, whether it's a common intellectual practice, whether it's a capstone, all of them could have a community-based component, could have a global component. So that I did want to keep this slide in and just remind ourselves that high impact practices tend to be siloed a little bit from each other. They tend to be thought of as somewhat discrete, but in many ways, particularly with a community-based or civic element, there's so much opportunity for integration there and for thinking about how we couple these effects. So with that, I will pause and passing to Kathryn. Yes, okay, yeah, Kathryn.
Thanks, Ashley, for that. Yeah, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So we began this project, I think, rooted in Ashley's really great literature review from 2011. And because of all the reasons she specified, we defined really strict parameters for inclusion in this follow-up research synthesis to ensure that we were collecting evidence with high levels of generalizability to broad populations of college students. This entailed assembling evidence with sufficient methodological scope and scale so that the findings that we were collecting could be extended beyond the boundaries of a single study or a single educational context. I think this differs in important ways from a literature review, because when you do a literature review, you're looking to broadly and inclusively assemble all of the evidence you can find about a particular topic. In contrast, we intentionally narrowed our parameters for inclusion in this research synthesis to address the particular issues that we had seen in literature to date. So on the screen here are the parameters for inclusion in this particular study. Again, we were picking up in 2011 after Ashley had completed the literature review in that year. We were looking for resources that were available, full text versions online for download in English, because that is the language of the researchers. We considered meta-analyses and analyses of original data. We did not look for summaries of data that were analyzed in other research publications. We were looking at the original research studies as they were published. We looked for multi-institutional studies involving 2 or more institutions, or for single institution studies that were longitudinal.
Than I expected. What is this for? It is about civic engagement in higher ed settings. I thought it would be really helpful.
There we go. Sorry about that. We also looked for single institution studies that were longitudinal or included data from multiple cohorts or academic years. Essentially, we were trying to make sure that the sample sizes included in these studies were sufficiently large so as to be more generalizable to a broader college student population. And then finally, we were looking for studies that included at least one of a range of civic or community-based engagement experiences. And as Ashley said, we were really broad in our net of what a civic or community-based engagement experience was. So we included service learning, study away, diversity experiences, global learning, internships, undergraduate research in community environments, field experiences, work study. All of those things can have a civic or community-based portion, and I think we were pretty broad about how we looked for studies that included those experiences. Finally, we included studies that analyzed at least one of a range of outcomes at the student and institution levels. And I think we were intentionally broad with that as well. We were looking for all kinds of outcomes that might come from civic and community-based engagement. Things like retention, graduation rates, but also things like moral responsibility and some civic outcomes that we may not have anticipated. So with these parameters, we acknowledge that these omit some really high quality and important research. We know that literature abounds with single institution studies that show us snapshots of individual courses or programs, and they're really powerful. They tell us powerful stories about the impact of those experiences. Again, the study did not include them because we were specific about looking for things that had greater methodological scope. I also want to acknowledge that we probably didn't find every single study that might meet these parameters. We used 2 institutional library databases and open access resources. All 3 of us worked together to search the existing literature. We think that our search reflects what's likely accessible to the typical practitioner, administrator, or researcher doing work in English, but we welcome additional sources that we might have missed, and we'll talk more about how to share those with us later in the presentation. Go ahead, Ashley. So again, I just wanted to stress that we were as comprehensive as possible in our search for relevant literature. All 3 of us searched for literature. We used a variety of relevant keywords to find literature that met the parameters, and we continually added new search terms as they arose through our search for literature. So here are just some of the search terms that we used to find appropriate literature. One that is not on here that I can use as an example of something that arose through our search is intercultural wonderment. That was new to me, and only after reading some of the literature we found did I think to use that as a search term. So you can go on, Ashley, from there. We were also as open as possible about the types of publications that we included in this research synthesis. We included both peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed publications. So you see, traditional journal articles and books here, but also theses and dissertations and conference presentations and proceedings. Again, we were looking to include as many studies as possible that met our criteria. The next slide begins to share what we found. So given our broad search and our knowledge of the considerable number of studies related to students' participation in community-based and civic engagement, we were surprised to identify only 53 total studies that met our criteria for generalizability. That is, we found only 53 studies published in the last decade of sufficient size and scope to be included here. Beyond that, only 11 of those studies focused on outcomes for underserved students. Studies that reported outcomes for underserved student populations tended to focus on a really small set of outcomes, such as GPA, retention, and graduation rates. These 11 studies also tended to report on racial differences as opposed to other demographic characteristics like first-generation status or Pell eligibility, for example. 38 of the studies we found, over 70% of the studies included in the synthesis, involved the collection of indirect self-reported data, such as through surveys or interviews. A very common mode of collecting data was through NESI. We saw that a lot in the literature. Conversely, less than 1/3 of our studies gathered evidence based on direct assessment data like graduation rates or assessment of student work, and 11% used both self-report and direct assessment measures. And then perhaps not surprisingly, more than 2/3 of the studies we found focused on service learning experiences. In comparison, only 21% focused on internships or field studies. 53 is not a lot. I was surprised by that, but I think there is some good news here. Because of the size and the scope of these 53 studies, they are really powerful. We can make some very meaningful conclusions about the effects of civic engagement in higher education and about what is missing about what we know about the outcomes of these experiences. So I invite Jessica to talk a little bit more about our findings there.
So leading on from Kathryn's last point about service learning, this visualizes how many more service learning focused publications there were as we've split up in those 6 outcome categories. So you can see that overwhelmingly, at least in this graph, we have service learning represented in all categories except institutional based outcomes. Again, I wanted to reiterate what Kathryn said about we are not assuming that we have found every single relevant publication out there because we were constrained by the institutional databases that we had access to, our language, what we could download full text online. But we do think that what we're talking about in the results that will follow is sort of a general representation of the trends in the data. We don't think that those trends would change substantially if we added in a few articles that we missed. But if, as we're going through this and you read the report later on, you do find a article or publication of any sort that seems to fit the parameters, please do go to that link or email one of us with that article and we'll see if we can add it to the annotated bibliography. That was my plug. I will move on to the next slide, please. So these are those 6 outcome categories that we keep talking about. In general, we found positive trends in this research. So although they did vary across publications, sometimes finding non-significant, sometimes significantly positive trends, and even sometimes within across varying groups within a single publication, the trends were largely positive in general, like increases in personal and social responsibility, developing more positive mindsets and dispositions, improvement in graduation retention rates and other institutional outcomes like the number of course credits taken, gains in learning, improving practical and intellectual skills, and increases in career-related skills. So that's also great news. We tended to see positive results from community-based and civic engagement activity in college students. Next slide, please. Okay, so what you can see here, not only did we see some community-based practices studied more than others, like service learning, some outcomes also appeared more frequently in the research that we found. So what you can see here is a summary of the results by outcome. In the red circles are the number of publications that investigated each outcome category. So many publications included multiple outcomes, and so you'll notice that if you add all of those up, it's more than 53. Outcomes related to personal and social responsibility, as you can see here, appeared in the most publications, including results like civic attitudes, civic and community-based engagement behaviors, civic learning, perceptions of civic and social responsibility, moral and ethical reasoning and action. So this is quite a wide category, as you can see. We included, just based on the definition of personal and social responsibility that we included in the report, we did include a number of outcomes that could fit in that category. So those represent 53% of the studies or publications in general. Fewer, but still a significant number of publications included outcomes related to mindsets and dispositions and institutional outcomes like graduation, retention, number of credits earned, that sort of thing. Mindsets and dispositions includes increases in constructs like openness to diversity, awareness of social issues, efficacy and belonging, to list just a few. And we have a broader list in the report. We did see fewer studies that focus on outcomes like learning gains, intellectual and practical skills, and career preparation. But given the context of this research, outcomes of civic and community-based engagement specifically, it makes sense that most of the outcomes that we found related to things like personal and social responsibility, mindsets, and dispositions. And so why might you think that graduation and retention and other institutional outcomes might also appear with more frequency in these studies, even though maybe they're quite a bit different than mindsets and dispositions or personal and social responsibility? Just to throw in a discussion question. Anybody want to take a shot at that one? I'm going to give you my elementary school teacher wait time, as I am a former elementary school educator. Yes, Crystal.
Is it because that's typically what we need to sell this work to our higher administration? That would be my guess anyway. I think that that's typically how we sell it, is like, hey, if we look at graduation, career readiness, right? Like, please fund this work. Please help us to really institutionalize this work because it matters.
And disclaimer, I don't have a correct answer, but we have some assumptions, and absolutely, this is we're speaking in the language of the people that can help provide funding by using those outcomes. Excellent. Is there any other reason, perhaps? In thinking as a researcher, that's low-hanging fruit. We collect those data already. They're easy to access. It's just there and available. Whereas, how do I study personal and social responsibility? Like, do we have a survey for that? It just takes a bit more to get into that type of data than it would maybe graduation retention. All right. So that moves us on to the next slide, which are our overall thoughts.
I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself. I'm sorry. There we go. Yeah, I think in Jess and Kathryn and I all have very traditional backgrounds as researchers, and it would just be unthinkable to end a report just like, oh, look at all these great findings. We look what we found. And all, some of what it does is, I always think a good bit of what any kind of statistical or even qualitative information would do is paint a picture of what's happening. Yes, you might have some ability to extrapolate beyond that picture, but at the end of the day, it's about giving people a sense of what we're seeing, and then how could we learn more? How could we know more about this? And I think one of the opportunities that we wanted to take with this, and I think also building on the terrific work at AAC&U by Dawn Whitehead and her Office of Global Citizenship, is thinking about how we are consistently infusing different language into the ways in which we approach this work. And I was mindful, I'll be very honest with all of you, when I came into the work a decade ago, it was right on the heels of CU's report on high impact practices, in which study abroad was identified. Study abroad is identified in that list of high impact practices. And study abroad, while effective, was always sort of this smaller bar in CU's work, in that early work on high impact practices, which of course does not mean it's effective. And those were still significant findings. My thought was, I think we're missing part of what the story is around what this is. And this clearly isn't exactly the set of outcomes maybe that we ought to be exploring this week. And I felt like in doing this research synthesis, we had a chance to both be very inclusive of not just looking at study abroad, but very inclusively trying to use the language, as you saw in the keywords, around global learning, around really thinking about how are we talking about global issues in even local contexts and domestic contexts, to really provide this much broader sense of what it is to be a global citizen. And that we had an opportunity to do that with this. I think we still saw a preponderance of studies really focusing, or at least labeling themselves as looking at study abroad. So it felt like there was an opportunity to say, and to suggest, at least again in the work that we were finding, how can we begin to think about how that work with the scholars that are looking at global learning, looking at that robust set of literature and findings around that, but think really expansively about what those experiences are and how we incorporate those into our discussions. I'm thinking very practically about where study abroad offices sit on campuses and where that Center for Service Learning or community engagement sits on campus. And I know in my own experience, working on a campus and developing a Center for Community Partnerships, those offices never talk to each other. So we really very intentionally put them along with internships and along with field work and community-based research, thinking much more about how this recommendation would be a nudge, both for the research to expand and how it might, but then also where the conversations on campuses might expand to provide some catalysts for those conversations. Kathryn?
Sure. I think all three of us have talked about the need for direct assessment of students' civic and community-based skills. Obviously, indirect data sources are also valuable. There's just a great opportunity here to expand our understanding by assessing students' demonstrated ability to apply civic skills. I think one example of how this can be done is through the AAC&U value rubrics. We are working on a national civic evidence project, again, funded by the Illumina Foundation, and it engaged a group of 18 campuses to collect samples of student work that were evaluated by certified scorers using the value rubrics for either civic engagement and global learning through AAC&U's value scoring collaborative. And our hope is that that contributes to the evidence base that we saw missing or a bit lacking in this earlier in our review. So this is something on the horizon that will be, I think, a really important addition to what we know about students' civic skills. I think that there are other ways to think about directly assessing students' skills that relate to student learning more than graduation rates and retention rates, and frankly, that relate a good deal more to our mission to advance liberal education and broad learning through these opportunities on campus. Jessica, do you want to talk about equity gaps?
I was actually hoping to go for the last two bullets if somebody else wants to take it, but I'm happy to chime in.
Yeah. I'll jump in on the equity gaps. One of the things that had been a target of an early focal point of CU's work and has consistent. It was an extension of it. Was some of the work that I did in 2013 with Tia McNair around assessing high impact practices for underserved student success. And we went after that research specifically from the lens, right? This is what all research should do, is like find the gap and try to fill that gap. We had seen such a dearth of evidence specifically teasing out what exactly did we think these compensatory effects were for underserved students. That was very much the language of that time. And Tia and I went after that again almost a decade ago, very close to a decade ago on that research. And it was probably as exciting as it was to pull this research synthesis together to look at 53 studies that were real powerhouses in terms of the robustness of the kinds of findings we saw, was that we're still looking at it at 11 that had intentionally, systematically looked at equity gaps in the findings. So this bullet is the continued nudge for thinking about how we build in those equity protocols into our methodologies. It goes all the way back to sample size collection, of course. That intentionality would have to be built in from the very beginning to make sure you're building sample sizes robust enough and inclusive enough to be able to do meaningful analyses. maybe easier said than done, but there are ways, even on campuses, where you say, no, we don't have enough students of color or Pell eligible, we just can't build well, you can over multiple cohorts. You can over time. There are ways to think about how you can accomplish that work, but those questions have to start early. And of course, none of us are saying that it's assessing or addressing equity is about disaggregation of data. That's one piece of a holistic commitment to what it means to actually understand what those gaps are. But certainly that kind of intentionality with approaching the work has got to be there, and it's really got to be there from the very beginning. So Jessica, your final two.
And I can add one piece to the equity gaps bullet as well. I remember when reading through those 11 studies, finding some really fascinating results, like at one institution who looked at different program areas and the impact of these community-based practices on groups of students from underserved populations in different program areas, and coming up with different results just based on their major of study, or based on in other studies the group that they identified with. So while one group might show learning gains or whatever the gain was, retention gains, another group that's also considered underserved student population didn't. It was really fascinating, and it just, if you were to look through which 11 studies we read for this report and read all 11, you would see that there are many dissertations just waiting to be written in the literature. And I wanted to just reemphasize that the literature that's out there is fantastic, but it's very few. And we absolutely have space for that. I really wanted the bullet on expanding the large scale studies to include the multiple high impact practices and institutional contexts, because I remember so well as we were going through the literature and realizing that there were very few studies that were including multiple institutions. And so then we had to sit down and go, okay, there's so little out there. We can't do a research synthesis on just multi-institutional studies because there's just a handful. How get studies that take place at a single institution and consider that broader, having that scope and scale that we were looking for. And then that's when we talked about multiple cohorts, longitudinal studies across years, those sorts of things. But it was quite a lot of great discussion amongst us as researchers, looking through the literature that's available and trying to find opportunities for generalizability in the results of the research synthesis. And so I would love to encourage you to go out there with your research chops, or people that who love to research, and push them to talk to their colleagues at other institutions, even if it's just a similar program at a different institutions. Consider that type of research, though I do know that it can be hard to do this kind of research across institutions when you start thinking about IRBs, et cetera, et cetera. We would just like to open that door nice and wide and invite people in. And what was it that Terry mentioned a little bit earlier, that also suggests a real need for more studies where institutions collaborate and are supported by a system. Just our results in general really show that more multi-institutional studies would be very relevant and very welcome in the literature. And then finally, I have the link for the annotated bibliography one more time. We do want to continue to build this resource because we acknowledge that we can't possibly have every single study that's out there, even just in terms of our personal access as researchers. So if you find something that does meet the parameters, please do reach out to us. Our emails will be on the next slide. We are very interested in including whatever we can on this crowdsourced resource.
So with that, let me go ahead and I'll stop sharing. We have about 20 minutes. Would love to get your thoughts, feedback, and I would love to just open it up for conversation if we can. Okay, there's a question, a terrific question. the process about developing the 6 outcomes. This is pretty quick, actually. There wasn't much of a process because we used our learning outcomes framework at AAC&U. That's exactly what those 6 outcome areas match to, including, my colleagues are just waiting. They're like, she's going to do the plug. She's going to do the plug. I'm going to do the plug. We are in the process of updating those essential learning outcomes. And you might have seen a survey about that. But we did follow what are since being released in 2007, the essential learning outcomes have been knowledge of human cultures in the physical and practical worlds. We did not include that. That has always been sort of the ether of the disciplines, maybe there's a term, but we have not defined that category, though we do think knowledge is important in higher education. But then there's intellectual and practical skills, personal and social responsibility, integrative and applied learning. And then what we will be doing is updating our essential outcomes list in this next go around over the next year to include a mindsets, aptitudes, and dispositions. So we absolutely wanted that category as well. We also added the institutional category to do exactly as Jess and Kathryn just outlined, was looking across institutions, what are sort of overall institutional effects in terms of boosting some of these kinds of effects. And we also knew we really wanted something around, and we haven't talked much, it occurred to me we probably should add a bullet on the vocation piece and the career outcomes. Again, now we would argue at AAC&U, any of those outcomes are related to career preparedness. Those are career preparation, that those would contribute to somebody's ability to flourish in lives and in their careers, all of those things. But we're also mindful, right, that our researchers have very specifically identified intent to pursue those kinds of outcomes or to link in very specific ways. So we just simply incorporated that into our language to look at those studies that had specifically tagged career outcomes as part of the process. And obviously very, very few of those. I did note there was a corridor conversation around the connection of civic learning with career preparation. And I wasn't able to make it to that, but I'm going to be following up with North Georgia about that topic. But I do think it's a really important one. Did I miss one? I wasn't keeping track as I identified. Did I miss one of the 6? Probably, but that was the basic idea.
I want to turn to Russ Wood's question about colleges and universities that incorporate student lyceums so that the students speak on civic engagement and civic learning. I don't know that I recall any specific studies where students were asked to speak on their experience. There were, though, studies that asked students to write on their experience and that used those writing samples as evidence for what the students learned through that experience. And there were a few studies even that asked students to write immediately afterward and that asked students to reflect then as alumni at some point in time. So they are in the annotated bibliography and referenced in the report. I can't remember, of course, the authors at this moment, but that was a source of information for us. What other questions do you have?
Did you, I should know this, but did you see any trends about the types of institutions that were in the studies, like, four-year research, community colleges, technical colleges, like, did you see anything there?
Gosh, it really, I think, ran the gamut of institutional types. I will say that research institutions were more likely to have some large samples from many years, large samples of students who had participated in experiences for many years. That's maybe by virtue of their size primarily, but community colleges were well represented, liberal arts colleges. Most of the studies, I think, dealt with institutions in the United States, but that was not the rule necessarily. Jessica, do you remember more trends in the kind of institution?
No, when you asked that question, I tried to reflect on that, and I really do think that we had a variety of everything represented in that.
Yeah, I come from a liberal arts college background, and so I was disappointed with the number of studies, high quality studies that we had to discard because they again looked at a very small cohort, a single program, single instance. But I think that was true across the board. I was just attentive to that sector because it's my usual area of research.
I'd love to hear this report in conversation with the last panel that we were able to hear around sort of the last question around the climate of the nation and the fact that, you know, half of the studies that took place that are covered here were post 2016 when so much of the attention was drawn to engagement and polarization. So, you know, the outcomes or the measures across these outcomes are so relevant, right? The inquiry and analysis, teamwork and problem solving, awareness of diversity, empathy. I'd just love to see if those two speak to each other in your minds.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely do. I think one of the exciting things about being able to do this work now is we probably are. I was prognosticating, I would say we might be on the precipice of like a new wave of this kind of research. So I feel like it feels important to have had this marker somewhere in between there, as I do think and I'm very hopeful about the ways in which this research will get more sophisticated by the kinds of organizing around that CLDE is doing, and the kind of support that is out there to bring coalitions together. I do think one of the things I hopefully you all are hearing, at least what I've seen as this forum has come together, is the importance of coalition building around this work, that there are areas of this that have been traditionally very siloed, but the energy around putting some of this research together, asking those kinds of questions, I'm really excited about where this research goes and the opportunity to at least have a little marker in there to suggest what we see right now are the gaps, so somebody doesn't have to take their time to go back and put all this together. But yeah, it's a great question.
I'm reminded too of the publication lag that exists in so many fields. You know, it takes time to do quality research. It takes time to get accepted to a quality publication or with a quality press. And so I think much of the work that we were seeing, even published in 2021, had been done several years earlier. And I'm not sure that it had benefited from some of the conversations that had happened since 2016.
And I would like to jump on that point and emphasize it in that one example of a study that we knew would be perfect, just looking at the abstract. And I checked every week through the institutional library database to see if it was available yet, and it just wasn't because it was too new. I could access the title, I could access the abstract, but I could not download the full text simply because it had been published only maybe 3 months prior to when we were doing this. And I kept checking and still didn't have access. I think all of us looked for that one article. So just to reemphasize that point that there's likely research even from the year that we were doing this that is not included because of lack of access.
And again, I was just going to say quickly, just underscoring the annotated bibliography in this. I don't know when the last time I was so excited about an annotated bibliography. This might be the first time, actually. But I'm so excited about its ability to be a kind of living document for this work. You know, oftentimes, right, the research we do is stuck at a point in time. It'll be that marker. And I really just, it was a brilliant suggestion on Jess's part, but even again from one of our colleagues at AAC&U, Kate McConnell, that thought, you know, you guys really ought to be putting together an annotated bibliography for this. It's like, gosh, that's a great idea. Definitely do that. So I know we're getting some questions in the chat. So let's go back up to John's question at SUNY Cortland. I've been on your campus, so great to see somebody from Cortland represented here. I know you guys do great work. In your research, did you find studies that identified faculty members' learning and or concerns? And John, I just want to make sure I'm interpreting the question correctly. So if you're able to just, do you mean like political concerns? Do you mean around academic freedom, freedom of expression, something like that, or?
Concerns, thank you for asking. Actually, concerns with regard to, well, two parts. One, what they're learning, because I try to approach it here where students are not the only ones who are learning, but the older adults, whether it's faculty or community members who are also learning skills or specific knowledge, but also any concerns that they have with regard to, for example, I didn't get any professional development. I'm jumping into this not knowing if this is going to hurt my chances for advancement and this kind of thing. Wasn't even thinking about those political concerns, although of course those are, especially in the environment, are very key. I hope that answered your question about my question.
That's very helpful. That's very helpful. I would say no. Well, broadly speaking, but Kathryn and Jens will weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, our parameters, we're looking for student learning outcomes specifically.
Yeah.
So we may have discarded or disregarded some studies that could tell us more about faculty members' learning or concerns. We did, though, find 2 studies that talked about institutional outcomes related to, as part of the study, in addition to student outcomes. So both studies found that the institution changed in the way it was teaching or in the way it was measuring things or in the ways that it made change because of integrating a civic engagement experience as part of their curriculum. So the studies in that regard were really interesting because they were pointing to individual effects for students, but also the effects of a change like this writ large on the institutional community. And in those 2 studies, obviously faculty members are part of that community who were doing the learning and changing the curriculum. So those might be 2 to look to begin to see some more research and around those areas.
And I can say I remember reading studies that did look at the community members' perceptions. Again, that wasn't part of our analysis because we were looking more at the students, but they are certainly out there. And I do remember reading multiple that, and some of them having had to be discarded because they didn't focus on students, did have some very interesting information about the relationship between what's happening at the college or university and via the community members.
A point
I'm going to look up the authors on institutional change while you guys answer questions. So.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you, Kathryn. And just a point to underscore that it's such a great question, John, and it's not at all that we're undervaluing that. It's just setting the parameters for this study, but I'd be very excited for somebody to take that a step further. Russ, your question, are there conversations about limiting, this is, I think, a terrific question around language and how language gets used. Are there conversations about limiting civic engagement to only civics? The search terms made me think that everything is politics. Well, if it's not all sociology, it's all politics. It's at least one of the 2. The language really is tricky, and it's why, as we created those keywords and terms, we really wanted to be as inclusive as possible, and starting with, as I mentioned at the beginning, the use of community-based work and civic engagement. I have anecdotally absolutely had conversations on campuses where 2 colleagues, I will tell you a very specific story of being on a campus and talking with the dean of the business school. And it was a project in which we were all split up into groups, and there was a group that was specifically going to be talking about community engagement. And so we were all sort of shuffling and going to whichever group that we wanted to go to. And I flagged the dean of the business school. I was like, oh, are you heading over to the community-based group? Because you guys run the internship program. I mean, they had like a robust internship program in business. And I'm sorry, yeah, maybe it was civic engagement, because he said we don't do civic engagement. We do internships, and that's what we do. But I've also heard this language around civics as well, which I think connotes even something even more specific than civic engagement. So the language is tricky. I would say we've, at least with our approach to this, we've just tried to be very mindful. And I would say in the national conversations, we've tried to be very mindful about how we bridge those. Jean, your question about the employer report is a good one. And my short answer to that, knowing that people can take a look at it, I too am very encouraged by what we found in the latest employer report around employers under the age of 40 who overwhelmingly, in the magnitude of 20 to 30 percentage point differences, valued community-based and global experiences more than employers over the age of 50. I think this is great news for campuses. It's great news for this work related to the early point around connecting with vocational and career preparation, how we don't leave these as binaries, that we're training students to be citizens or we're training them to be good workers and solid professionals. These are actually complementary benefits. Bob Bringle was on the call at some point who did terrific work around the civic professional, how we actually think about the fluidity of the connection between these two realms. We're going to keep studying that trend with employers under the age of 40. We'll undertake a new employer survey coming up in 2023, and that's going to be a target for that to see if we end up replicating it or what we learn more about it. Those employers who are under the age of 40 are the oldest millennials at this point. We might be seeing really important generational gaps for how we're envisioning this work going into the future. Great news for campuses, but something we want to study much more.
And I can add something about that data point. The career category focused on outcomes that very specifically were career oriented. But we do know that there is interest in things like civic learning, which are represented in some of the other outcome categories. So not everything that is career oriented is necessarily in that career category. We just found some outcomes that were very specific to careers and couldn't quite fit anywhere else, if that makes sense. And so they needed to have their own category. But what you mentioned about civic learning would be represented in the personal and social responsibility category.
Russ, I'm not the one to answer that question. I don't know. Kathryn, Jess, anybody? I feel like this is an all state. I feel like everybody should get in. Yeah, Eric is great. That's a good one. Eric Liu's great. Okay, Russ. Good tip on the social media. All right. We'll circle back on that. Thank you. Any other, we just have 2 minutes. So any quick thoughts on anything we can be doing at AAC&U? We will have as was alluded to, we will soon have a new report on from our civic evidence project that is gathering direct evidence of students demonstrated civic learning through work products leveraging our value scoring collaborative. We've got 18 campuses nationally that are participating in that study. So about 1,800 pieces of student work that are being analyzed. So very exciting about that. And yes, Terry Taylor, multiple institutions, yay. So that's exciting. So please keep an eye out for that. But anything else that, and Russ, happy to loop back with you on other opportunities for grants around civic engagement. Lumina is just an amazing partner for this work, but there are other possibilities out there. I do think we're at a good time. If those of you have been in this space for a while, it has traditionally been hard, I think, to get funding in this area. I think it's looking better now. I think we really have captured the attention of funders, the importance of capturing this, fragility of democracy. Kettering, we have had a recent conversation with Kettering, Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, Teagle potentially can be somebody to look at, Mellon perhaps, but there's some real possibilities here. And with that, I know that we are at time. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with this work with you, to learn from you. And please send us a note at any point if you can contribute to the annotated bibliography or help us to know what we can do more. Thank you all. Appreciate it. Happy holidays.